Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Today is April 8th, 2025, and tonight we will be going over the book, The Peril of Fascism by A.B. Magil. Tonight we will be doing part one of the book. We'll be covering three chapters within it, but this book is very pertinent to what's going on today, and even the subject it was writing on back almost a century ago at this point still holds a lot of relevance today, and we will eventually be publishing this book. A few notes before we begin. The People's School of Marxist-Leninist Studies is a party of communists, USA initiated and sponsored schools. This is not a party school, though, so this does allow us to have a wide variety of topics and discussions. All PCUSA members need to have their name set as your first name and state. This is for attendance tracking. Also, during the question comment section, if you would like to ask a question or raise a comment, please make sure your video is on and we can see your face. If you can't get your video on, you are welcome to pass your question or comment on to the moderators and we will read it out loud. And so with that, we'll be going over the first three chapters tonight. The first is The Nature of Fascism. The second will be The Germ of American Fascism. And the third is The Effects of the Economic Crisis. And our first section is Nature of Fascism. You have the floor.
Yeah, so before I go, what said was very much correct. This book was written in 1938. It was during the Roosevelt administration when, after, the corporate America started to turn on the administration, they were, calling him, ironically, the fascist while they were the ones actually trying to bring about fascism. There's a lot of relevance to today, as we'll see. They use the slogan "America First," just like our current administration. And you'll find in this series the group, the Liberty League, which they refer to in this book, is a lot like the Heritage Foundation of today, the architects of the Project 2025. So I'll get started now. So yeah, fascist demagogues hide the true nature of fascism. Americans who hate fascism because they know what it means in Europe and who would reject it under its own name sometimes follow fascist and semi-fascist organizations. When these hide their real purposes and programs under the cloak of 100% Americanism, most Americans, while maintaining a healthy abhorrence for fascism, have only the vaguest conception of its nature and origin. They identify fascism with brown or black shirts, with clicking heels and marionette salutes. They would not recognize it in a full dress suit or a priest cassock or the homespun of a backwoods Hitler. And as you can see, so this was at Madison Square Garden in 1939. This was led by the not neo-Nazi, the basically the American section of the Nazi Party which was called the German American Bund. As you can see, they use symbols like George Washington and the American flag. And then right in the middle between the flags, you can see the swastika. And they talk on the banner up above, it's talking about free American. So, okay. So fascism takes on many disguises. It cannot afford to reveal itself, to proclaim its aims. Hitler would never have achieved power if he had announced to the German masses that his program was a program of big business, of the Thyessens and the Krupps, that Nazi rule meant lower wages, ersatz clothing, which means rags, essentially, concentration camps and cannon instead of butter. It was necessary for Hitler to call his party National Socialist, to promise to abolish unearned income, confiscate war profits, and nationalize the trusts. The quote unquote socialist coloration of Nazi demagogy was necessary because a large majority of the German working class and a large part of the lower middle class believed in socialism. And on the side, American tycoons also supported Nazi endeavors. There's this claim that because Nazi calls itself National Socialism, that it must be socialism. But why would so many corporations around the world be so gung-ho in supporting them? In the United States, where there is yet no widespread socialist sentiment, fascism takes on different and specifically American disguises. In order to win popular support, it must appeal to the ideals and slogans in which most Americans still believe, to liberty and freedom. It must even pronounce itself as anti-fascist. And again, you have what's that group? Mothers for Liberty. They regularly put out fascist rhetoric and support anti-democratic policies, yet they call themselves Mothers for Liberty. An even greater danger arises from the belief that the United States is immune to fascism. Most persons who hold this view regard fascism as a specifically European virus that can never, or hardly ever, thrive in free America, which has known the blessings of democratic government. The visible attributes, now we're going into the class basis of fascism. The visible attributes of fascism have been clearly perceived, even if not sufficiently understood by most Americans. From recent events in Germany and Italy, most people in this country know that fascism means rule by force and terror, that it suppresses democratic rights, that it destroys independent workers' organizations. Sounds familiar. That it fosters race hatred, that it brings cultural stagnation and decay, that it means jingoism and war. But these attributes do not exhaust the definition of fascism. They do not explain who exercises this rule by force and why. They do not explain the class basis of fascism. Without such an understanding, we do not know the real nature of fascism, whence it arises, and consequently how to guard against it. Writers on this question advance various and totally different explanations of the class character of fascism. Some, accepting the pronouncements of the fascists at their face value, deny that fascism has any class basis whatsoever, and maintain that fascism means the establishment of the authoritarian state, which stands above all classes, parties, and sectional interests. Others hold that fascism represents an independent movement of the impoverished and desperate lower middle classes against capitalism, on the one hand, and against the working class on the other. Still, a third view is that fascism is the open terrorist rule exercised by and on behalf of the most reactionary sections of big business against the masses of the population, and especially against the working class. And that's the one that we, as communists, subscribe to. The flawed conception of fascism as a quote unquote middle class revolution is based on the fact that fascism, in order to win popular support, raises pseudo-radical slogans, and that in Germany and Italy it succeeded in finding mass support in the lower middle classes. But neither the propaganda nor the popular following of a political party are adequate criteria for judging its real class nature. The avowed programs of the most capital or of most capitalist parties are notoriously at variance with their real aims, and the most reactionary capitalist parties can, under certain conditions, succeed in winning support among classes with diametrically opposed interests. And as you can see, after Hitler was able to rise to power, on slogans such as breaking up the banks so that we can have small business, he then went on and sent his troops to kill the petty bourgeois, such as Ernst Röhm. Some will, claim that it was because he was that because he wasn't a straight, he was gay. But the reason was is that the middle classes in Germany were starting to realize that they had been duped. And with this mass unrest, Hitler had to send his troops to put an end to them. From its very inception, the Nazi movement had the support of powerful bankers and industrialists. Since 1927, it has had the backing of all the Ruhr steel interests, headed by the industrial tycoon Fritz Thyssen. Ernest Henry, in Hitler Over Europe, describes in incredible detail how Thyssen organized the Ruhr coal, iron, and steel barons behind the Hitler movement and collected large sums from them for Nazi election funds. In the 1932 elections alone, he writes, Thyssen provided the Nazis with more than 3 million marks within a few days. These were profitable investments for the Thysens and Krupps, as the history of Germany since 1933 demonstrates. According to statistics concocted by the coordinated statisticians of the Third Reich, profits during the first 4 years of Nazi rule soared to enormous heights, while wages dropped even below 1932 crisis levels. And this should all sound, familiar. So today we have the Heritage Foundation and this Project 2025. So these are only a few of the companies that, that are putting their support behind Heritage Foundation. But rest assured, it is, there's a lot more. And it might be worth doing further research into which companies it is. But for now, I'll go. So Adolf Kohr's Foundation's tax documents reported by both ProPublica and SourceWatch.org. According to those tax documents, the Adolf Kohr's Foundation contributed $1,325,000 to the Heritage Foundation between the tax filing years 2008 and 2022. According to tax filings and forms published on ExxonSecrets.org, mentioning ExxonMobil's corporation's private foundation, ExxonMobil Foundation, which spanned the years 1998 through 2012, showed ExxonMobil contributed at least $730,000 to the Heritage Foundation. The Walton Family Foundation, the founders of Walmart, describes itself on its website as continuing a philanthropic vision begun by Walmart founders Sam and Helen Walton. The website's grants featured a search box allowing users to easily locate past contributions. The website displayed contributions to the Heritage Foundation from 1992 through 2018, totaling $650,000. And on the right, you can see, again, what we were saying, fascism in America dresses itself up as liberty, and it uses the iconic Liberty Bell that is found in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So.
Thank you, comrade. With that, we'll break for a round of discussion and questions. If you have a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function, and we will get to you in the order they go up. Comrade Andrea, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick reminder, although Donald Trump is a fascist. The United States government is not, as of yet, a fascist state. Not just yet. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you, Comrade Andrea.
Yeah, like I remember that about talking about like groups, fascist groups calling themselves Liberty. The Liberty back during the 30s under FDR, there was the Liberty Lobby, which was against the New Deal and was pseudo-fascist at least, and the price position that Trump is fascist are like opening the door for fascism. Thanks.
Right.
Thank you,
And yes, you're correct. The Liberty League of the 1930s is very similar to the Heritage Foundation of today. And this is something I'm interested in, finding out more about is whether they have direct lineage to each other. I would say they do based on their programs, but finding that connection will require some research.
thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask, how far back does the word fascist actually go? How long has it been in use? Thank you.
Um, well, I mean, I think that as soon as Mussolini started his movement, I mean, fascist just means a bundle of sticks in Italian. It means essentially it symbolizes that the nation is stronger when they're together. But I know I see some other hands up, so I'll let
Comrade Angelo, you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah. If you look at the dime, the old dimes, I don't know about the new ones, has on one side the fasci. Actually has it there. It's a symbol of power. So if anybody has any change with them, look at the old dimes. You'll see that it is weeds tied together, and at the end is a hatchet, like a tool. And that was the symbol in Italy, and that's why the first term came from, fasci. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
I think we mentioned Henry Ford, the American industrialist who was good friends with Hitler. And Hitler wrote about Henry Ford. He said very positive things. They both spoke very positively of each other. You can maybe think of other car industrialists today that say things about fascists or maybe even just do signals. And there is a good book called Who Financed Hitler. It was not, I don't think it was written by a communist, but I found it from a Jewish affairs issue. So the communists were referencing it. They have a whole chapter on Hitler and Ford. And Hitler definitely focused on communism and the Jew, where Ford focused a bit on the Jews and capitalism. And it's interesting. He even wrote in the International Jew that
60 seconds.
the Bolshevik Revolution was funded by Jewish bankers in New York. So I look at that book if you could find it online if you want more of that history. That's all.
Thank you, Comrade. Another note on Henry Ford. The Ford Motor Company sued the U.S. government in 1952 because they bombed their plants in Berlin where they were making tanks for the Nazis, and they actually won that case. Look up a David Rovek song about that. It's quite humorous.
Yeah, a particular thing that I found fascinating was when because basically at the beginning, at the beginning periods of post-World War II, Merriam-Webster dictionary actually had a very similar definition to fascism that the Soviet Union had. That it was most reactionary, most viscerally reactionary elements of finance capital being in control. Now, later on, of course, actual American corporations lobbied against that definition, citing that they didn't want that kind of publicity. So Merriam-Webster changed definition, and now today, essentially, it's essentially just a very vague definition of authoritarianism right now. That's all I gotta say.
Like how people can edit, anyone can edit Wikipedia these days.
fascinating is that even when on the eve, which is fascinating, is that on the eve before the Soviets broke through the border lines to enter Berlin, about a month or two, Henry Ford was called in by none other than what was his name, Goering of the Luftwaffe, and apparently Hitler was using, because Goering was very close with Henry Ford and even the other industrialist, who was in Britain, trying to get them to see if they can use their economic money influence back in Britain and the U.S. as a means to try to drive wedges between the Soviet Union and Britain and the United States, because as a way to try to like vainly attempt to prevent make it harder for the Soviets to do their operation in Berlin,
60
because
seconds.
the agreement table between the Anglo-Saxon parts of the Allies and them, which was pretty interesting, trying to mainly use industrialists at the very last minute to drive a wedge. Thank you.
Thank you. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor.
Yeah. Okay. The campaign posters on German walls in the election for 1932. It's a very famous poster put out by the Communist Party of Germany. Had a picture of Hitler, a big picture of Hitler, and the slogan said, "There are millions behind Hitler," because everybody said there were millions of people, right? There were millions behind Hitler, and then on the bottom in big letters, million of German marks. And behind Hitler, you saw all this German marks, all the money. I thought that was a great poster. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. With that, we will now go on to our next section. Our second section is the germ of American fascism, and comrades, you have the floor.
The development of American capitalism. American capitalism developed in a rich land, unhampered in the main by feudal restrictions, and society was not divided, as in Europe, along sharp and comparatively fixed class lines. There were merchant princes and propertyless wage earners, semi-feudal plantation lords and chattel slaves, but the uniqueness of American society lay in the fact that property ownership was widespread and class lines exceptionally fluid. Perhaps a majority of the American population consisted of free and independent farmers and small artisans owning their own means of production. However, the swift development of American capitalism, inevitably accompanied by the concentration and centralization of capital, rapidly narrowed the social basis of American democracy. Decisive for the development of all sections of the population and for the future of American democracy was the emergence of capitalist monopoly and trustification, growing inexorably out of the centralization and concentration of capital. Triumphant capitalism not only bound the workers to wage slavery, but narrowed property ownership by steadily squeezing the farmers, petty manufacturers, and merchants. The former independent commodity producers of the frontier were transformed into small capitalist farmers, selling their products to markets controlled by the monopolists, buying their manufactured goods at high prices dictated by the monopolists, paying tribute to the same monopolists in the form of interest, exorbitant railroad rates, and high tariffs. No longer a land of opportunity. Thus, by the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was no longer a land of opportunity, where the acquisition of property was comparatively simple and where classes were in continual flux. American society was now divided along substantially the same fixed class lines as the advanced European countries. At the top were a few giant capitalists who controlled the means of production. At the bottom were the vast masses of propertyless wage earners. In between were the middle class property of city and country, people of city and country, ground down by oligarchs at the top. There's quote, "The fruits of the toil of millions are boldly stolen to build up colossal fortunes for the few, unprecedented in the history of mankind. And the possessors of these, in turn, despise the republic and endanger liberty. From the same prolific womb of governmental injustice, we breed two great classes of tramps and millionaires." This was in the 1892 Populist Party program. With the era of monopoly capitalism, the American democratic credo lost its social basis. Democracy, as Lenin remarked, became more strictly bound by the narrow framework of capitalist exploitation, and consequently a democracy for the minority, only for the possessing classes. Freedom meant that freedom of monopolies to exploit ruthlessly wage labor, to exact tribute from the farmers, to crush petty rivals. Equality of opportunity meant the right of the worker to sell his labor power if and when he could, and the right of the petty capitalist to compete on equal terms with the giant monopolies, which controlled sources of raw materials, markets, and patents. Transforming the American government. Big business lost little time in starting its task of transforming the American government to suit its own needs. Hardly had the Civil War ended when it pushed through a clause in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution forbidding the separate states to enact or enforce laws depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. This seemingly harmless provision, smuggled into an amendment supposedly intended to guarantee rights for Negroes, attracted little attention at the time, but it constituted a profound governmental change, vastly enlarging the powers of the Supreme Court. Under this clause, every state law attempting to limit hours of work, establish minimum wages, restrict child labor, etc., became subject to the review of 9 men, generally former corporation lawyers, appointed by the president to the Supreme Court for life. The assault against democratic rights was begun on a large scale during a series of gigantic strikes which swept across the country during the 1870s and 80s. The courts revived the doctrine that trade unions were malicious conspiracies. State legislatures began to turn out new conspiracy laws to restrict the right to organize. Numerous state armories were erected throughout the country to facilitate official strike-breaking troops. Industrial barons began to build up their own private armies of professional killers, armies of company police, which in some industrial communities soon became a force far more powerful than the law. At the same time, they grew up in private detective agencies furnishing gunmen and spies of those employers who did not maintain their own mercenary armies, the notorious Pinkerton Agency being the most famous among them. Important innovations in capitalist rule. In an effort to crush the trade unions and maintain the existing working hours, the ruling class introduced 3 important innovations in its technique of rule: the labor frame-up, the use of formerly innocuous city ordinances for the suppression of civil liberties, and the anti-labor injunction. The frame-up was not a new invention. Similarly, most cities had long maintained ordinances against obstructing the streets, trespass, intimidation, inciting to riot, etc. The injunction, an ancient legalistic device which had never before been used in labor disputes, was brought back and remodeled into an anti-strike weapon. The use of the injunction in labor conflicts represents a profound alteration in the methods of capitalist rule and a drastic abridgment of democratic rights. It completely sets aside ordinary legal procedure. A court may issue an anti-strike injunction which completely nullifies the workers' supposed rights of free speech, press, and assemblage. A worker violating such a court order is deprived of trial by jury. He is instead haled to court and sentenced by the very judge whose order he is accused of violating. The 1890s also saw the creation of additional devices for restricting the liberties of the people. Perhaps the greatest contribution made during this period to the new methods of capitalist rule was the use of state martial law in strikes. Under martial law, ordinary civil processes and democratic rights could be suspended, and troops acting under a governor's orders could imprison strikers without the troublesome formality of court hearings and trials. The germ of American fascism. In June 1917, Congress passed the Espionage Act, imposing heavy penalties on any person obstructing recruiting, encouraging insubordination, or otherwise interfering with the mobilization of the country's military forces. The law, written in broad enough language to include practically all forms of opposition to the imperialist war, was used to jail militant working class leaders. In May 1918, Congress passed the even more sweeping Sedition Act. Workers were thrown into jail for doubting that the World War was fought to make the world safe for democracy. Pacifists, socialists, and militant trade unionists were spied upon, hounded, tortured, and jailed. Newspapers criticizing America's entrance into the war were suppressed. provocateurs and spies were planted in workers' organizations, and an unofficial espionage force of 200,000 private citizens were organized by the Department of Justice to snoop on friends, neighbors, and fellow workers. Beginning in 1923, there was a steady concentration of power in the hands of executive officials and a corresponding diminution in the power of legislative bodies. There was also a rapid increase in the size of the government bureaucracy, and particularly in the size of the armed forces maintained by the federal, state, and local governments. As economic power becomes increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few financiers, and as the interests of this small oligarchy become more and more sharply differentiated from the interests of the masses of people, there is a growing tendency to reduce the power of democratically elected bodies and to substitute open force for democratic processes. Thus, glancing back over the history of American capitalism, we see that it repudiated the traditions of its own revolutionary past and created new traditions of naked violence, and that monopoly capitalism bears within it the germ of fascism.
Thank you. Very quickly, we're going to watch, this is Smedley Butler laying bare the plot by fascists to overthrow the government of Franklin Roosevelt.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff, or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institutions. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
And with that, we'll break for our next round of questions and comments.
So when I was listening to that, there's a lot going on. The news is very depressing, but I think what was happening today was the Supreme Court ruling on Trump's, enactment or carrying out the the Alien Enemies Act of like 1798, which basically now gives him free reign to basically deport anyone as an enemy of the state. I guess immigrants are invading, but that is the term that they're using now, that it's a war against us, is what they're saying. At least that's how the Supreme Court basically ruled that. And when I was just hearing what Magil was writing in the 1930s, that's the first thing that came to my mind. And I think there's just going to be huge ramifications for what can happen in the future for that. So fascism maybe isn't completely here, but it's here.
Thank you. Comrade Andrea, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah, this goes back to the first section. Now, I just want some clarification. Was there anything socialized under Nazi Germany, or did they literally just take the name National Socialist? Does anybody know if anything was socialized under Nazi Germany? Thank you.
No, nothing was definitely not socialized. The war machine was nationalized, but what that meant was the armaments industry, even though they were still running for private interests, the state had stronger control over what they produced and how much. That was just so that the war machine had what it needed to go to war. But nothing was socialized, as in it was, nationalized for the benefit of the people. They tried making it seem like the workers had a say. They had I forget what it was called. It was,
Labor Front.
yeah, the Labor Front, which, was it was a business union, or it was, I mean, even more extreme than a business union.
60
They had
seconds.
no say whatsoever, but it was, put up as if it was a labor union.
Thank you.
So back to the other thing that I forgot which comment brought up about being deported under the New Aliens Act. Recently, I don't know if you guys know this or been catching wind of it, but even people who are legal American citizens that aren't even newly immigrated to this country in the last like couple months or year, people have been here for generations. Like if you're the generation like me whose family had been here for centuries, even by the time of the first American Revolution, people who are speaking out that are even being politically activist against what Trump is doing, that actually under that Aliens Enemy Act, there's ways that they can say that they have right to deport you, even if your family has been here for decades and centuries. That's how easy it can be. It's not just immigrants who are newly immigrated here. It's also people who your family's been here for decades and generations. And they can find a way to say they can deport
60
you
seconds.
as an enemy, just so that everybody's aware. If we're being politically activist, we need to be aware of it. That's a risk we're taking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that also when you're deported to El Salvador, you are no longer have jurisdictional rights, so you can't even, as far as we can tell, appeal this deportation. And I also mentioned that in the original Aliens and Seditions Act, there were a couple questions. One of them being, do you support anarchism? And another one being, do you support world communism? And both would immediately eliminate you from being allowed in the country. So we'll hope that doesn't come back.
Thank you. Yeah, they called it under the Enemy Aliens Act, which I'm not sure if it's the same as the Alien and Sedition Act. I'd have to do more research on that. All right. If there are no other questions or comments, we'll move on to our next section, which is the economic impact of the crisis. This is talking about the early 20th century economic crisis, but we definitely found that a lot in this chapter was applicable to today. And you have the floor.
The effects of the economic crisis. The economic crisis provided the conditions necessary for the speedy growth of embryonic fascism. The crisis shook to its foundations the whole economic structure of American capitalism and stirred up enormous latent forces of social unrest. It revealed that American capitalism, despite its apparent colossal strength and invulnerability, was undergoing the same process of decay which had produced fascism in Europe. It was during the economic crisis that the most reactionary sections of American big business turned in the direction of fascism, and that a whole crop of openly fascist organizations first made their appearance on the American scene, as we could see there on the right. Yeah, the general crisis of capitalism. Long before the 1929 crash, Marxists had proclaimed the fact that the American colossus had feet of a less substantial substance than bronze. They had demonstrated that American capitalism, despite its seeming solidity and enormous resources, was not immune to the laws of capitalist development and the general crisis of world capitalism. But their voices were drowned out by the beat of stock tickers and the ballyhoo of politicians and soothsayers who assured the American people that they had at last entered the promised land of everlasting prosperity. Presidents and press agents, bankers and AFL officials, preachers and professional economists all promulgated the philosophy of the new era. The capitalists and the workers marching hand in hand onward and upward along a smooth road to plenty. This was the post-war epoch of the, quote, new capitalism, when, according to the soothsayers, if not the statisticians, the ownership and control of industry was being diffused by stock sales to millions of small, gullible investors, industrialists, led by the super philanthropists. Henry Ford proclaimed to an odd world their professed belief in high wages. High wages to the labor aristocracy, speculative profits gleaned from the stock market by several million small fry who had been lured into gambling on the exchanges. Widespread installment sales of radios and automobiles lent credence to the new era myth, made it seem to a large section of the working class and the lower middle class that the day was close at hand when there would be a chicken in every pot and an automobile in every garage. But throughout the new era, the elements of general crisis were at work in American economy. Their subterranean rumblings were audible to those who had not been deafened by the ballyhoo and the Buckhamby artists and soothsayers. And there on the right looks like the young person's illustrated guide to American fascism. It says prescient, searing social political art, New York Times. Okay, and the general crisis of capitalism continues. There was, in the first place, the chronic idleness of a large portion of the American productive plant, an unmistakable symptom that the conflict between the productive forces of American economy and purchasing power of the masses had reached a critical point. Along with the machines doomed to idleness by a decadent capitalism were millions of workers reduced to permanent unemployment. Improved technique and intensified speed up raised the productivity of the average worker 53.5% from 1919 to 1927, a far more rapid rate than the increase in production. Talking about the general crisis of capitalism. Millions of workers in manufacturing, railroads, mining, and agriculture were displaced and thrown out of their jobs. The fact that 1/6 of the earth, the Soviet Union, had been removed from the realm of capitalist exploitation further accentuated the economic and political struggle among the imperialist powers and caused them to cast longing eyes at the rich territories of the Socialist Republic as offering a possible solution of their difficulties. Thus, in the period of apparent prosperity, the weaknesses and contradictions of capitalism, not only in the United States, but throughout the world, were combining to make inevitable the crash of 1929. These weaknesses of the new era were discernible to all who cared to see, but there were not many who were willing to look. Marxists, who attempted to call them to the attention of the country, were denounced as crackpots, too demented to glance at the soaring lines on the stock market charts for confirmation of the new era of permanent prosperity. The loudest denunciations of these sour prophets of collapse came from the gentry in high offices of the American Federation of Labor, who assured the workers that those who doubted the new capitalism and the benefits of collaboration with employers were troublemakers in the pay of Moscow. And I guess this is a quote from his prison cell, Hermann Goring. The people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and are exposing the country to danger. It works the same in every country.
Okay. Thank you, comrade. Can I get a volunteer to read the second part of the section?
The economic collapse of 1929. The 1929 crash came as a profound and bewildering shock to a country which had been fed the new era humbug. All classes shared in the bewilderment and incredibility, unable to believe that the rosy promise of the new capitalism could end in the wreckage which they saw accumulating around them. I'm thinking of Trump promising the new golden age. The engineer in the White House and the self-hypnotized tycoons of finance and industry solemnly assured the people that the crash was only temporary aberration of the stock market, if not of imminent revolution. The more clear-sighted and progressive sections of the labor movement demanded that the capitalist class shoulder the burden of the crisis for which it was responsible. And they succeeded in mobilizing large mass movements behind such demands as adequate unemployment relief, social insurance, and a shorter work week without reduction in pay. In these movements, the Communist Party played the leading role and the most dynamic role. During the first few months of the economic crisis, the capitalist class attempted to perpetuate the class harmony myth of the so-called prosperity era. Conferences of business tycoons and the AFL leaders met in Washington at the invitation of President Hoover and adopted solemn resolutions to continue the status quo. The employers promised to maintain employment and current wage rates. AFL-CIO officials promised not to call strikes, but these pledges were soon abandoned by the captains of industry themselves, if not by the leaders, the generalissimos of the AFL Big Business Program for the Crisis. And there you see a good poster. Captains of industry with their hats on and their big bellies, or robber barons, because that's what they were, robber barons. And you see the poor people at their knees. With profits rapidly dwindling, the monopolies, dropping their former pretenses, ruthlessly attempted to solve their difficulties at the expense of the people. They closed factories. They fired workers. They slashed wages. They attempted to maintain high monopoly prices, while the prices of raw materials, which they purchased from farmers, fell to the lowest levels in many decades. But even these heroic measures were insufficient, and the long-awaited upturn was still invisible. In the meantime, the position of even many of the larger corporations, particularly in the railroads industry, was being undermined, and many crashed into bankruptcy. And there you see a picture of a capitalist giving out something to the workers. Let's see what that is.
It says special privileges, immunity from, I can't read that.
Okay. The growing
immunity from arrest.
From arrest. Okay. The growing fascist tendencies of big business was shown in an enormous propaganda campaign for the establishment, quote, of a strong government and the diminution of the powers of Congress. Doesn't that sound familiar? A campaign which was at times openly fascist, the increased use of violence against workers and farmers, and the suppression of democratic rights, and the formation of numerous fascist and semi-fascist organizations, many of them directly supported by big business. I'm thinking of January 6th of 2 years ago when they stormed the White House. I keep thinking of that. Big business moves towards fascism. The attack on Congress was accompanied by a savage assault on all civil liberties and democratic rights. As growing numbers of workers, farmers demonstrated their refusal to starve quietly and loudly voiced their demand for relief, the capitalist class and the government authorities representing it increasingly resorted to force. In scores of cities, unemployment demonstrations, they were called unemployed marches, by the way, were broken up with police, bullets, and tear gas. Troops were sent out against strikers, black sharecroppers attempting to organize the unions were hunted down and lynched in the South. A wave of deportations swept the country. Does that sound familiar? States revived old criminal, trade union, and sedition statutes, and professional patriots clamored for new repressive laws. And there you see a cartoon. I want to see that cartoon showing wage cuts into the workers' house, how they're putting wage cuts in with a bubble, a balloon. The big business moves towards fascism. Again, the fascist organizations attracted members by denouncing with typical Hitlerian demagogy the so-called international bankers and the so-called corrupt politicians. Does that sound familiar, comrades? These slogans appeal to confuse and bewilder people who vaguely sensed that Wall Street was responsible for their misery, but who did not know how to fight Wall Street. The cry for a strong government, strong leaders, which the fascists took up, also struck a responsive chord among those bewildered folks who were looking for some kind of messiah, some kind of leader. Sound familiar? Some miracle to lead them out of the wilderness. Oh my God, this could have been written yesterday morning. This was written in 1938. God. Big business moves towards fascism. There's a cartoon there of big business, and I cannot read what he's standing on. Anybody knows?
Profits from building materials, profits from people's food, profits from war trade clothing, interest on war loans, all the profits.
Okay. Thus, at the low point of the economic crisis, American big business was moving quickly in the direction of fascism. Many of its most prominent representatives were openly denouncing parliamentary government and calling for dictatorship. Sound familiar? Papa Smurf, Papa Trump. Throughout the country, democratic rights were being curtailed, and hungry workers tear gassed and shot down. Fascist organizations and would-be Hitlers were springing up. American democracy faced a grave crisis.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. So with that, we will break for our final discussion round.
Yeah, I've interesting when you talk about in the 20s, like you talk about the more executive authority being concentrated in the 1920s. I hadn't heard about it. I thought that the 20s was Silent Cow and Warren B. Harding, and that I remember reading that like it was like presidents didn't have too much authority back then, and it was mostly like laissez-faire economics. I don't remember any of the things he talked about.
Thank you. I know a lot of the text history textbook discuss how the 20s were the roaring 20s and it was laissez-faire and business was booming. Remember at this time, though, that worker strikes were getting suppressed and workers were fighting for better wages. A lot of them were struck down. And as well, this was also the time of the first Red Scare back in the 20s, and there was sweeping executive authorities to basically round up, try, imprison, or kill or deport anyone suspected of being Reds. For example, Sacco and Vanzetti, for one.
Yeah, so I think we'll probably go into it more in our other classes in the series, but it was an important point was brought up by Comrade Andrea earlier, that even though there is a push towards fascism, the U.S. is not quite fascist yet. We do still have a right to organize, which is being attacked, day by day. But, the same thing was happening here as we were seeing in the 30s. And they succeeded in, keeping fascism away. They did it by actually organizing. I bring this up because, there were those hands-off rallies that happened a few days ago. Now, of course, you have some conservative and reactionary elements of the Democratic Party that are, trying to co-opt them, to pull people back towards the corporate DNC. But we need to understand that this is where the masses are. They see that there's an attack on democracy, and they are coming out against this. Now, the ultra left is trying to say that because there were reactionary elements trying to co-opt it, that these protests should just be thrown out with the bathwater. This is a very incorrect analysis. The trade unions were involved with them. The trade unions understand that if they don't stand up now, they're not going to have the right to organize. So, these are the opportunities we need to connect with the masses. Even if the masses aren't where we would like them to be, we have to meet them where they're at.
80 seconds.
Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Yeah, leading the masses, not running ahead of them or tailing. Comrade Angelo, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Okay, I just want to make this quick. When Hitler came to power, he passed laws, executive orders, without the parliament. I don't know if you know this. Without the parliament involvement, he passed executive orders. What Trump is doing now, exactly. It's not a coincidence. No other president has passed so many executive orders, none, in 100 days that they've been in office than this guy. Every single one goes bypast the Congress. The Congress is no longer acting as a Congress, as a check on the president. So I just want everybody to be aware of that. The Democrats are very feeble, ineffective in their opposition, and the Republicans are quiet. So that's the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo.
I kind of see the Democrats as feeble, but at least very disappointing defending democracy. But we definitely, and actually Magil talks about this. I think we say ultra leftists, he said super leftists, where he says they, have this analysis where they think capitalism is capitalism, and that's wrong. There's such thing as a bourgeois democracy, but even like today, the liberal politicians won't even defend it. So it has to be us that defends it. And that goes to what we saw on April 5th I did see unions involved in the hands-off rallies. Also, what Magil talks about, they mentioned the leaders of the AFL and how they were kind of just cozying up, or at least being agreeable with Hoover and what was going on with the employers. Well, they lost their jobs too.
60 seconds.
And they did eventually, organize alongside with, the communists, the socialists, and the rank and file. So, it's not to say we should just give up and that we'll eventually fight fascism. No, we have to organize. But you do kind of see that happening now. As I said, like April 5th, it was an example of something building around an anti-fascist coalition.
90 seconds. Thank you, comrade.
Essentially, basically, Congress exists now only in name, really, and in a building and a facade, but any real power it has, it's zero at this point. It's no surprise because Trump has been, if you're him, you're to have been successful at getting away with this as he has, he'd be looking at what were the mistakes made by other people and other presidents that tried this. They didn't do as many executive orders passed as possible. So unfortunately, the fascists have gotten smarter, learned from their mistakes, but so do we. We've got to get smarter. And at this point, if things continue the way they're going, for how much longer are we going to have any of our democratic rights that exist at all that have any real weight? I can tell you this, not very long at all. We're going to have to start being prepared to be thicker skinned at this point to be safer than sorry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, talking about what did he say about hands-off protests again? Like I heard that some people were criticizing because I saw a sign online that said like one of the protests saying hands-off NATO, and people were upset online, on Twitter were upset about that. And what you're referring to about some reactionary slogans and the Democrats are trying to co-opt the protests, but we still need to support them.
Yeah, exactly. Right now, is not the time to, demand ideological purity from the masses. It's a common thing, I think our people from our labor commission would, know this best, that, trying to yell from outside of a union at union leadership, it's not going to get people to listen to you. You need to work within those crowds, and over time you expose corrupt leadership. Only then will those masses start to trust us as leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. Comrade Angelo, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll make it very quick. This is the question we should ask ourselves. Who is the main threat to us right now? Right now, who is the main threat? Is it NATO? Who's always been there? Always a threat. Or is it this new threat? This fascist threat? This demagogue? Ask yourself that question. Who is the main threat right now? And that's what the Soviets did in World War II. They joined with the capitalist United States, who they hated, who they railed against for years, against the main threat. The main threat was fascism in Germany and Italy. That's the difference between leftists, communists, and the ultra-left. The ultra-left doesn't see any difference. They're all no good. They're all no good. And so what does the ultra-left do? Nothing. Therefore, they're not part of the struggle. Remember, this is an army. When Lenin called it the Communist Party, the military command. That's what Lenin called us. That's army talk. That is army talk. We are and as Stalin said, we are the army of the working class against the army of the capitalist. It's very clear. Therefore, we're in an army In an army, you don't turn around and run away. You don't go AWOL. Otherwise, what you're doing is you're helping the enemy. Think about that. Thank you.
New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing house, and I will turn over the floor to him for an update.
Yeah, please visit our partner publishing house, New Outlook Publishers. You'll find a lot of great works, and they go to support the school. Once again, newoutlookpublishers.store, build your own Marxist-Leninist library. And this work from A.B. Magil will be there by at some point by next year. But we have a lot of other great works, and please check those out. Thank you.
All right, and we'll close out with Paul Robeson.
What is America to me? A name, a map, of a flag I see, a certain